Good afternoon. I'd like to call the workshop to order. Today is April 16th, 2019, and we have a couple of items on our shortened workshop today. So first I'd like to call Carol Leishon forward to talk about our internal auditor.
Mitzi, are you coming for moral support? Okay.
And Mitzi Corcoran, our CFO. And anyone else? just someone in the audience?
Yes.
You sure?
She's on the on deck.
No, Krista? We'll know that she's there if needed. Good afternoon.
At the previous workshop, we discussed the requirements of the law. From there, a conversation took place whether it was the will of the board to hire an individual, a board-appointed employee, or to go with a firm. Although it was in a workshop and no vote was taken, it was the will of the board to pursue a contract with an outside firm to do the function of an internal auditor, which led to your invitation here today. What we needed to know is, do we invite Carol or do we invite Roy? Are we writing a job description or are we going to go look for services? So to set the table for you, the reason you're here is, yes.
We'd like to just give it a minute. Are you finished?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Give it a minute.
Hand up over here. I still don't exactly understand.
Hold on a second. Are you finished?
Yes,
Okay.
I am.
Okay. Shirley Brown.
I know we talked about it, and then, you know, from there to there, I got an audit report that we have done. I mean, how many audits are we required to do, and how is this different than the audit that I received after the meeting?
Sure. As part of your board materials, you should have Florida Statute 1001.42, which is really the mandate for an internal auditor. I would tell you that as many laws are, there's some vagueness in the laws, particularly around what the word employ means. Does that mean hire as a board-appointed employee or engage the services of a firm? We are comfortable that employ can be interpreted either way. As far as the number of audits, there is no requirement. We have a statutory requirement. We receive an annual audit, and Mitzi certainly can speak to that function, but the role of an internal auditor, number one, it works at the will of the board. This would be a direct report to you, either the firm or the individual, and then you would direct them to perform various tests of the organization. Many times when you hear the word auditor, you immediately think finance. That is not always the case. You can test compliance with various policies, laws, rules, in addition to doing financial tests.
So this would be in addition to that annual audit that we normally have on the finances. This would be another audit.
Correct, and it would be ongoing, and so it would essentially be, you would ask for a special report. You would have access to an internal auditor, and you could say to that individual, are we fully complying with this statute? Are we fully complying with this law? Are we fully complying with a particular board policy? Or you could do additional financial tests of both transactions or controls.
And in order to get this person to do something, we as a board would have to approve it. I mean, we couldn't have a board member going to this internal auditor telling them to do something. It would be the will of the total board, correct?
I believe that the individual works for the will of the board, that an individual could not operate in autonomy unless you were to exercise and to grant that authority. So certainly a majority of you could say, we empower the chair or an individual board member to direct the work of the internal auditor, but ultimately you would be delegating your authority as a full board if you chose to do that.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Okay, and we are still not sure whether or not the revenues that we have exceed the 500 million that is required to the auditor, depending on which figure you look at on our summit budget.
That was my question is.
So there has been a question. Apparently there was legislative staff who made a request of DOE of the districts that would require internal auditors. And they were provided with a list of which we were not on it, but it was those with 500 million or less in general fund revenue, not total revenues of the district. So it's the interpretation of because this particular document that was included in your read ahead is our general fund only, which is 428 under the 500 million threshold. In total, when you add your food service revenues and your capital revenues, it would be over 500 million. So we're still waiting. We've got to call into DOE to see if they know anything more about it. It's just information we received. Don't know if it has any value or not. So, but irrespective, siding on the erring on the side of caution, we would proceed.
Well, I was looking at this handout that you just gave us.
I got that actually from Manatee and asked Kathy to give it to everyone.
And I've looked at other audits that were done in other districts, and there are a number of them. But usually there may not be an auditor who would fit the requirements of every audit that we would want performed. Therefore, we might want to have several different should we go with an outside auditor, if we need to do this, then would there be certain skill sets that would require doing and having the services of various auditors?
And you would indicate that in your RFP. You would want them to give you their key personnel and their qualifications if we went with the RFP.
Bridget?
So I actually reached out to Scott Hopes from Manatee County. I know that they just recently went through, within the last year, I want to say, with a whole, for an internal auditor, and they do have an outside firm. So I actually asked him to email me, which you'll have, Kathy printed out. It's an RFQ, so request for qualifications. I know in our read ahead we had a sample that was provided, but from West Virginia, I just didn't know what the relevance was. So when I was reviewing that, and also I think that was post-secondary, since I knew our neighboring county and they're also in Florida and they're also a similar sized district, I thought that would be helpful from a relevant standpoint that we could look at. Also, another component that they have is the 5-year audit cycle plan. Again, I think that's a little bit farther down, but I thought it was a good opportunity for us to look at kind of a high level of what they've incorporated. And the other part is, again, hinging off of what Shirley had said, is when I've looked at other districts that have done this or other government entities, oftentimes they'll have an audit committee because we're subject to sunshine, so we're limited, but we don't want to, and we're spending dollars, so we want it to be as effective as possible. There is also legislation going through that requires that audit committee to be, if it's for a government agency, and I would say it likely to pass, I don't have the bill number, it's an Accountability Act or something, that it would not allow a member of administration to be on the committee, but then would be there as not a voting member, I suppose. Yeah. So, and so it has to have a minimum of, and this is very likely to pass, so I think it would be prudent for us to consider it as potential if we don't want to later, but it's also best practices, and it would be subject, I think, July 1, 2019. So it would be almost immediate, which has a minimum on those. So similar to Financial Advisory Board, we would put out and ask for volunteers within specials who have special backgrounds, whether they were I think in Manatee County has a previous superintendent, some are CFOs of other previous organizations. But again, I look at what we have for the Financial Advisory Board, and I also asked Manatee County to send us that charter, just again to look at the different buckets we have to do, an RFP or RFQ, consider an audit committee, and that way we would have the chair or a member of the board sitting on that to be our liaison, to bring back that information, and then have members of the community volunteer to sit on that board based on their expertise. And that way, that would kind of help shape the scope, review different findings, and then the one appointed board member, whoever they may be, would come back and let us know what's happening. So that would be my suggestion, to go kind of that route.
Thank you for this, Manatee. I did talk to Ruth Ruitt over there, the purchasing director, and she is in the process of negotiations with their incumbent. So this hasn't been finalized yet.
But it was a good
Yeah.
guiding. Right, I do. I believe they already actually have one in place too.
Shirley?
Does Manatee County fit that 500 million threshold? I mean, because I'm like,
They're bigger than we are.
you know, if we don't hit the $500 million threshold, I'm like, well, why would we want
Yeah.
to spend money on this if we don't have to at this time when money's tight? But
I would argue that it can be also something that pays for itself when you find efficiencies in a number of things, especially when we are in a tight budget. And this is something I've brought up that I wanted prior to it being mandated. It is a best practice. I was surprised to see the 428 as not, because we do receive capital dollars, and that would be, in my opinion, where we would go over that $500 million threshold, and that does include, because if you read the statute, it's local, state, and federal dollars. It doesn't identify that it's specified to operating. I'm curious what DOE, because that was interesting that they'd said that. But again, we're so close. If we're not now, we would be likely next year. And I would argue it's a best practice and definitely something that would pay for itself and help us, hopefully, as we face some challenging financial times.
is this more like what MGT did several years ago when they looked at how we were performing?
I think there's a parallel. MGT was a one-shot deal. They kind of took a snapshot in time, where this is more of an ongoing. But certainly there's parallels to what MGT did.
Thank you.
Eric, don't you have a question?
No, I have statements, but I'm waiting.
Caroline? Well, isn't that nice? So Eric, why don't you start?
Well, I wanted to get everybody's gist, so I just want to make sure that, just go back to what, Dr. Bowden explained it eloquently, but if I can just go off on a tangent to my own edification, say it again. So we have a financial auditor, and that auditor takes the financial statements that our staff develops and says, do they materially represent the financial condition of the board? That's what the auditor that we normally think of. Then we have the Auditor General comes, like Dr. Bowden says, and they look at, we follow our rules and procedures, and they give us findings if we don't follow the rules and procedures. I look as the internal auditor as kind of doing both things, but more importantly, doing operational audit things, kind of like the MGT. Are you doing this thing efficiently? Is things falling through the cracks? They could go out and audit how we do our counts. Does that process that we have internally, is that efficient? They could go and audit to see are bus stops in the right place. So these things necessarily aren't financial, maybe not necessarily, state laws, but are we doing things in the most efficient way? And so having their input on how to do things efficiently would save us money. So the question is, can we afford to have an external auditor? The question is, can we afford not to have an external auditor? That's the question I would raise. So we had an issue, about a finding from the AG. And the question is, we all talked and we all agreed that we were going to bring an external auditor for that, and maybe they can come in and help us with that process, and the end result of that may end up, saving the district money. So again, I think we can't afford not to hire an external auditor. But I'm still confused, like Ms. Ziegler, because it says, in the case this school district receive annual federal, state, and local funds in excess of $500 million.
Right.
And our 1.5 capital is local funds.
Agreed.
Okay.
What we've said is there was a list produced for legislative staff by DOE. We don't know. That's all we know. We don't know if that's because they're changing and the intent was it was just general. I have no idea. So we're just aware of it. It doesn't, and like I said, I believe we should err on the side of caution and proceed and move forward with whatever you need to do to be in compliance with the statute.
Okay. So I think when we start talking about the qualifications of an external auditor, to me, we should look at two main things. Our biggest thing should be, where does most of our resources go to? So one of them obviously is construction. So I would want somebody, this is me one, I would want somebody who has experience in school construction, Florida school construction, and know how the process works, how the funding comes, and the rules and regulations that we have to go under. So that's one thing I'd want as a board member. I'd want one of their qualifications to be. Another qualification I'd want them to know is how the FEFP funding works. I'd want them to understand how we receive our funds and how we're required and we're hamstringed and how we have to spend those funds. So that when they come to us and they offer up a suggestion of efficiency, they need to understand that some things we do is simply because of the nature of the beast and the rules and regulations that we have to operate under. So I want the person to have the qualifications under that. The next thing that I think that we spend, although not a lot of more time on, is things like, I want to have somebody who has an understanding of curriculum, somebody who understands education, who has an educational background, so that they can look and see all the schools, fulfilling those type of responsibilities. Are they delivering the instruction in the manner in which that the landing says that they want them to? Because sometimes there may be a disconnect between that, and just that overall somebody who knows how to advise in operational efficiency. It's one thing to, I have this at my office. It's one thing to be able to sit there and do the numbers and type on the calculator and get, you can 2 and 2 4, but what does that mean? We need to have somebody who understands how to, think outside the box. I want somebody who can advise us on, give us advice on things we can do or shouldn't do. And again, it's just an advice. So I would want those types of things to be the qualifications to be put in whatever thing we do to look for people. But I'm just one board member, and that's my suggestion.
But I'm concerned about an auditor versus a management consultant. MGT was a management consultant.
Well, I think the external auditor acts as an auditor.
Let me finish.
Yes.
And a bus stop and checking bus stops is not something that I would think I would want an auditor to be involved in. It's choosing bus stop locations. That would not be something that, if we're talking all these jobs that we're talking about, we're going to have somebody inside who does that all the time. We're going to have somebody that's backlogged 2 years out. If we're saying, okay, we're going to look at every school, we're going to look at every project, we really have to be very selective, I think, when we start with this, if, in fact, this is the way we go.
Madam Chair, but when auditors audit, they don't look at every single thing. They take samples.
Samples, and yes, I'm aware of that, Eric.
I was just using the bus stop as an example of, because we spend a lot of money in transportation to look at overall efficiency. And so an external auditor is more of a consultant in advising, so that's why I mentioned advice. They're out there giving you advice and looking at overall efficiencies of the organization. They're not really, going in and saying, hey, you really should accrue this expense and not, taking it all this year. That's not really what an internal auditor would be doing.
And do you see people in our area that have this skill set, since you are in that CPA business? Yes,
there are people who are in our area, and actually I would, to highlight that, I'd probably say that we wouldn't pay for travel or local expenses in order to get somebody local.
Yeah,
so I would like to see that as part of the qualifications, is that we won't pay for travel. But there are people, in fact, Manatee's internal auditor is although it's not a local firm, but they have a local office here. But they're backed by the 22nd largest CPA firm in the nation, but they have a local office here. They bought Shin and Company, it's public knowledge. They bought Shin, and so Carl Riggs and Ingram is the internal auditor now of Manatee County School Board, and so they do governmental audits throughout the southeast part of the United States, but not just. So you would get the local people here who do Manatee, but you'd get the breadth and knowledge of the entire CPA firm. So
I do also have the SCF award notice, and they awarded to HBK CPAs and consultants.
The external auditor.
Yes.
The external auditor is HBK. The external auditor is Carl Riggs and Ingram.
So, but we're talking internal.
Right.
For us.
This says internal.
Caroline.
It is internal.
The first thing I think we have to decide is, do we want a firm? and listening to all of the things that have to be audited, it sounds to me like you're not going to get that all in one person. So I think the first decision we have to make, is it a firm or is it a single person that we're looking to hire? And after we decide that, it's silly of us to try and sit together and write up an RFP. So I would recommend that we ask the chair to work with our CFO and the purchasing to develop an RFP for us to review before it goes out, to see if it has everything that we want in it, instead of the 5 of us trying to sit around and draw up an RFP. That would be. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. So as far as the scope of work, I would think that the scope would just be what's outlined in the statute, which is, the reviewing of financial transactions in determining whether or not there's adequate internal controls, efficiency of operations, reliability of your records, et cetera, et cetera. So
I'm not hearing that, Missy. I'm hearing much more than that.
Oh, no, I know. I'm just saying, to me, that's the scope. The qualifications of the people that you're having come in do this work, you may want pretty expanded qualifications. Obviously, they have to have a history with school districts, I would think.
I have developed an RFP process, and within that, you look for previous experience, their methodology, their qualifications, their record of implementation ability, and I have pass-outs if you want. Quality of their performance history, who's the point of contact, progress meetings and what you expect out of the progress meetings, progress reports, and then some point structures. Submittals would be understanding the district's requirements, their approach and work plan. You want to be as concise as you can to eliminate questions. I know one of these, SCF or Manatee, had 37 questions. Because it was more vague. One of them had 37 questions from the vendors.
My other
Bridget.
question would be, could we not use our financial advisory committee as the finance committee? Because a lot of them have financial experience.
That's very true. Bridget?
So going off a couple things that Caroline said, I agree. I thought, and if I've misunderstood, I thought that we had kind of discussed going down the role of hiring a firm versus individual at the last meeting. This is where we're kind of going in this direction, which is why I pulled this information. I agree that as long as we have kind of input on what the framework is, having the chair, work with Carol just to draft it and then bring it back to us. I think. Thank you for the timeline, because the timeline's key, especially since we're working backwards from July 1st to now, and they happen quick, but responses happen quick and such. So, and I know there are other districts that we could pull from. Again, just Manatee being close by, I do think a local firm, if possible, is better because they know this area. But I think Eric hit on some areas that I want to see as far as making sure they understand the FEFP funding, have experience in education, not just government entities, but specified school districts, because there's a different beast, which in that they would have some experience within transportation, understanding efficiencies. One other thing that Eric said that I thought was interesting when I did some research, a lot of the ROI is found oftentimes in contract services, and because a large expenditure is so much towards capital improvements, there are a lot of opportunities for savings when we have, if that's once we have a committee and we give a set task for them to audit. I mean, if that's one of the things we look at. So, because I'm obviously cautious of expenditures, but really wanting to make sure it pays for itself is kind of where I think we have a good opportunity here. So, the other thing I wanted to ask is whether we do an RFP or an RFQ. I mean, I know they're somewhat semantic, but they are different from a response standpoint. What is your?
Well, an RFP, you're including pricing in there. You're not just basing it just on qualifications.
Okay.
That's the primary difference.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can negotiate the pricing, your short list, based on their qualifications and the price, and then negotiate.
Okay. Very good.
Whereas on a RFQ, you're negotiating with the top ranked based on the qualifications. Right.
Oh, there was one.
So we're talking RFP, correct? Everybody in agreement with
everyone in
that?
agreement?
Eric?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I mean, I, you know, like when we're looking at somebody like that, it would be hard to find any one person with all those qualifications. And I'd like to be watching, and I'm sure you probably are, talking with other districts about what they're doing. And are they basically going out with RFPs and?
No. Most of them have internal auditors themselves, and they're restructuring. Lee County right now is doing the same thing tomorrow at their board workshop.
Doing what? Looking at RFP
Looking at-
versus an internal?
Exactly. So Lee County is doing that tomorrow. They received a price from their clerk of courts for 1.2 million for 7 people to perform.
Well, you know, that's another, I mean, we're saying we want an RFP versus an internal, but it's like, I mean, are we talking about spending $1 million versus spending
No.
$75, $80, $100,000 for a person? I mean,
Well, Lee County's got 92,000 students too, so
And we have control over, I mean, it depends on the scope of work. If we give them a long list of stuff and the hourly billing is going to be, but we should start being cognizant of what our budget allocation is towards it, which I would argue need to be lifted just for it to be reasonable. But, and again, that's why I keep going back to making sure we're cognizant of how do we approach the scope of work once they're hired to make them pay for themselves, essentially, and really target those areas where we can hopefully.
I think Lee is probably looking at construction services because they're up
Right.
22,000 students in the last 10 years, and they have a very aggressive construction backlog.
And that's why I had a difficulty finding, because so many districts do have an internal auditor, and they are changing their scope of work on who they report to and.
Right. Most internal audit functions within school districts, though, are mainly the internal accounts
Right.
auditor. So they're mainly looking at the activity accounts at schools. They're not doing these types of functions. They were usually a unit underneath their CFO or finance director, not separately
Right.
afforded. One other thing I'd just like to ask really quickly is, within the scope of work that you will be tasking them to do, is their function going to also be where people would who people would contact to report fraud or suspected fraud? Would we institute a fraud hotline that would have their number on it? Is this a place that the principals, or is this the entity the principal would contact if they had questions regarding a booster organization, a PTO, even their own bookkeeper? These are functions that most other internal audit departments that are at a school district do. I'm just not sure, because right now those are all
Right.
done by us. So I'm just not sure if that's something else you would want them to be tasked to do, other than the risk assessment and the other things that are in there.
Bridget?
Well, no, I was going to ask about the risk assessment, but is that something, and Eric, I'm going to defer to you here just because this is somewhat of your wheelhouse.
Somewhat has experience, somewhat has knowledge.
Yeah, someone has knowledge.
I said somewhat.
Yeah,
No.
somewhat. I
Somewhat.
don't do this type of thing much. I do some forensic accounting. Yeah, that's a very good question. Should they go to the fraud? I would think shouldn't go to them, because then what are they going to do with that information? I mean, they're just going to take that information and bring it to the board chair, because you don't want them to act upon it. They don't have the ability to act upon it. I mean, the question is, what does somebody do now who reports fraud?
We investigate.
Who's we?
My office.
Well, you can't. I mean.
Well, I mean, we do. We go into a school. We'll look at every single transaction. If they have a concern about a booster organization, a PTO, a school bookkeeper, and we'll go in and then we write a report, send it to the school.
Then what happens?
Yeah, but the problem is you're not
I'm not independent.
That's the
Correct.
problem.
Agreed.
I think the only person somebody could.
She wants us to do
I know.
I read you loud and clear.
If you ask me what I think we should do, I think if someone reports fraud, it should go directly to the board chair, and for the board chair to determine the validity of it and determine, what the next step is. You can't have a staff member doing it
That's
because
what it is right now.
nobody except the 5 of us is independent.
That's unfair, yeah. It's not fun.
I mean,
I just wasn't sure, legal.
that's not a reflection
reports
upon
the
staff.
board
That's a
also,
reflection
but staff work.
upon me. I just want to make sure that is not a reflection upon staff. That's
No,
a
I
reflection
know.
upon
No, I
the
know.
reality of the situation.
Agreed. I'm
Shirley?
not independent.
Yeah. I don't think if somebody thinks that the PTO has done something wrong, that we should be looking at the internal auditor to be doing that, because it might take, I mean, I think if somebody did something wrong, I think Mitzi can look at it, and if they see anything odd, you know,
Report to law
I mean,
enforcement.
that's theft. Don't you call in the county? I mean,
Law
I
enforcement.
don't know that I would want the board to be doing all of that. I mean, if you know, I don't think we want. I don't want to be looking over the PTO's finances. I don't know how they run it well.
Third party.
Well, if they have real PTOs, they have a lot of interface with the state PTO organization, but we only
PTA.
have one of those.
No, the
PTA.
state, it's the state PTA versus the PTOs.
Right.
But I mean, right now, I mean, to me, unless we run into a problem where we think there's a problem, I mean, I don't know why we can't let Mitzi take care of it unless there's somebody thinks that it isn't being done efficiently or well or followed through. Then we can look at somebody else to do it. But like, you know, I mean, to me, I don't think we're here looking for those nickels and dimes. We're here looking for the big dollars. And I don't see why we would want to spend big money on an internal auditor looking at that stuff. I mean, especially when if they're mismanaging the money, they're taking the money, you call the sheriff.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a good one.
Eric?
I just want to make clear, I was answering a question that was asked of me. And so she asked me that. And the CFO and myself both agree the issue is of independence. I wasn't trying to imply that Jane Goodwin would go out there and look at the books. What I would say is, take a hypothetical. Want to take the PTO? PTO goes to Chair Goodwin, and Chair Goodwin, I would imagine, would say, Mitzi, or Todd, can you have Mitzi look at this? That's what would happen 99% of the time. The only reason why you'd have to have it the board chair, because if somebody's accusing financial fraud and it has to do with the finance department. Right, that's why we talked about independence, because she's not independent of it. Yeah. That's why you'd have to go to the board chair, and then the board chair would be able to exercise his discretion and say, Todd, what do you think we should do about it? Should I go to the external audit? I was responding to the answering of a question. I wasn't saying
That's
that
fine.
I thought we should do that.
But
I was explaining why I gave my answer. And my answer wasn't to imply at all that Jane would go look at the PTOs. Did I explain myself?
Yeah, I never thought that.
Yeah.
But
But I do think using that example in general, not that we would direct the firm, whomever they may be, but the audit committee may be somewhere where that would help. Saying, I mean, I don't, but saying, okay, is this a big enough situation where, you know, tell the board this is maybe something you guys want to look into. If not, or you pivot over to law enforcement. I mean, if there's commingling, if we're talking third-party organization, I don't want us. They can hire their own internal. It's just when it's commingling with our dollars back into the district, that's on us, I would assume. But I'm not sure how that works. But you had mentioned something about the Financial Advisory Board, and I was thinking that the only thing I worry about is that, when I don't know, I mean, they have had their scope of work since they began has continually grown, but I also think that they have great intellectual capital on there, and it may be a good idea to use that. But again, just beware of the statute, and I know what our current policies are, is that we don't want board members on certain external committees. And for the audit committee, if this one piece of legislation passes and it's effective June 1st, 2019, we would be required to have a representative on from the board. So I just want to
maybe we better hold off and see.
That's why I wanted to make sure, because I know
the end of and the end of session is coming quicker than I'd
very
like.
quick. Yeah.
But yeah, well, either or, it's unpleasant. But
we could always change the scope of the Financial Advisory Committee.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there would be no problem doing that.
Oh yeah, no, I was wanting to make just if we added a board member, and I believe in our current policies, and something that they liked it being independent of a board member. That's what currently exists, but this may be different, and it may be a different beast because it's an ongoing. If I've looked at other charters, they meet almost the same frequency of Financial Advisory Board, once a quarter. Because we're going to be spending these dollars, you really want to have the right structure in place that whoever that committee is, if it's financial advisory or if we start our own separate to that they're able to really steer that train solely on the audit so that we're making those dollars work.
Here's my thinking of why using them, because they know our system. Mm-hmm. They know education. They've been involved in it most of them for quite a while.
I don't think it's right.
Because he sat on it before, so that's why I asked.
We could have. I'm sorry. We could have I don't know that they even want to take this on, but
Right.
perhaps a member of the Financial Advisory Committee
Sit on
being
it.
on this new audit
a good
committee.
point.
Because
That would be
I guess, and again, let's wait until the session's
Yeah,
over
let's
and they
wait.
tell us what we want to
Yeah,
do.
Let's
We're
see.
getting into the weeds.
Let's see how
and
many
let's
things
talk
change
about the
between now
RFP
and you know, the end of the month or
But
whatever.
think about it, because you have to put those
all have
requests
to
out
be
really
together.
quickly.
Right.
Yeah, and so, and we need I mean, my personal opinion, you need an audit committee if we have an auditor, because we have, like I said, we're hamstrung by sunshine. We all want to have some kind of representative on there. So I wouldn't wait just on session. I was just saying if we.
No, not on the RFP. No, I don't think we can wait on the RFP, but I think we can wait on deciding what flavor we choose for our committee. And I think maybe it would probably behoove us to have two separate committees, but maybe have some transition among oversight and then who
I agree.
wants to be on the
Okay.
committee. Eric, I'm sure, wants to be
Yeah, I
on
do.
the committee. What is this?
An RFP.
It's the process. I did already.
Okay, Carol, let's,
You did.
Points if I
You
might.
did.
yes, Dr. Bowden.
Just a couple points that I want to reemphasize. Much of our conversation is centering on the financial components of it, but understand that an internal auditor looks beyond finances into policies, procedures, operations, and so much of the benefits that accrue are inefficiencies, but not necessarily in a monetary way. And although if you ask me a simple yes or no question, will an internal auditor program pay for itself over time? I would respond yes, but with a couple caveats. Number one is the internal auditor will be funded out of the general fund. Any findings or recommendations and ultimate savings will accrue to the program at which they audited. So if you're looking at a capital program, any savings would accrue to the capital fund. If you're looking at a federal grant, any savings or efficiencies would accrue to the federal grant. And so I just want to be real clear that if we're sitting here a year from now and saying we expended X on an internal auditor, did it pay for itself? It may or may not pay for itself in any given year, but over the course of a program, it certainly would. I just want to make sure that we have an understanding going in that, hey, the more we spend, the more we get back. That's not necessarily how that works. But yes, over time, the program will, I believe, pay for itself. It may not all accrue to the general fund, and we need to understand that it may accrue to the capital fund, a federal grant, or wherever that program was funded.
But we would know where that was so that we would see what those savings and
Certainly.
savings are savings.
Certainly.
Good point.
No, but we'll be expending general funds that could be caught or recouped in capital, not the general
Yes.
fund.
Yes.
And not all efficiencies are financial in nature.
Right.
That's
Which
right.
is his point, yeah.
Right.
And I guess what I want you to know, this is a long-term investment that you're making, not a short-term one.
I think CPAs are worth it.
But this is beyond the
Agreed.
scope of,
We agree.
and I guess the other point is, this is beyond the scope of your typical CPA. that
Yeah, well,
they're-
maybe they can look at the efficiency of school board members. Maybe we don't need 5. Maybe we can get by with just 1 or 2.
Are you fine with 2, Bridget? It depends on which 2 you're talking about.
Oh, my Lord. So, moving on to the RFP.
All right, go right ahead, Carol, please.
All right, so picking your committee, ideally it would be 3 members. That's normally what we get on an RFP committee. That's entirely up to you.
Wouldn't it just be the 5 of us, and we would do it at a board meeting? Because it's a little different, no?
You're talking about the,
Statutes that I'm covered under are exempt from open. That you still have to publicize
Right.
and record the meeting.
But we
we're talking about the committee itself.
But they're not in the sunshine.
I think the concern is if you were to shortlist and ask for a presentation, they all get to see the presentation.
Yeah, so.
But, and then they could tweak theirs or whatever, and they can all see each other's. I mean, there's just some concerns. That's why it's always been done in the, at a committee where somebody can sit and listen, but it's not usually televised and
Right.
in an open meeting, where
It's-
you guys have to meet in an open setting. So, I mean,
I'll have to get with Art because
gonna say,
mine are closed for 30 days.
This is going to be different.
Yeah, at this whole cone of silence.
Yeah.
And things like that going on. So that's where the one concern is. Again, if you had an audit committee that was reviewing them versus the board reviewing them, then it would be fine. So it's totally your call how you want to do that.
So if I'm working with you on the specifications, or if everybody is going to give input on the specifications, they can send everything to Jane, and I can work with Jane on developing of the specifications. You certainly can have a couple of these samples on the point structure. Also, I'll need to know point structure totaling 100, with cost being the least.
I think it makes more sense to do
Value.
it that way.
Okay.
And I certainly can fill in a lot of the empty. I have a boilerplate
Good.
language that,
All
But-
of the legalese and stuff
Good.
is already all done. So it's
That's-
mainly just the scope of work, qualifications, the specifics of what you're looking for that we'll need to know.
I'll need to know cyclical visits. How often do you want them to make it through the whole district? Is it 1 year, 2 year, 3 year?
Well, there's specific language within the statute that to me kind of defines what they would need
Okay.
in terms of, they have to do a comprehensive risk assessment.
Every 5 years. Yeah.
Every 5
That's why I
years
gave
of all
this.
areas within the school system. And then,
Yeah, I think we should follow the RFP process and then look at what the statute says, And at this point, I mean, if, we follow what the statute said first, if we want to expand on that in future years. But I think it's enough to just start with what the statute said.
Yeah.
that's the scope.
Let's do that.
Now, as far as pricing, I would think you would want hourly. I can't see
Yeah.
any other way you could do it. Now, the one from West Virginia, I do have how they awarded it. They awarded they had 5 or 6 different individuals with pricing, and they awarded a blended rate based on the percentage of time each individual would spend on any given project.
And I know that we have to make sure that if we're paying anybody on an hourly rate, we found out from our audit that we have to keep track of their hours, if not punch cards, and they have the sheets, don't they?
Very explicitly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I know CPAs, and I actually worked for a CPA.
Did you?
One tax season, and you had a sheet, and you had to put the little tenths of an hour or whatever you were working on.
0.1 every 6 minutes.
Yep.
Eric?
The downside of the blended rate thing, it gives them incentive to use the lower level staff and, use a staff member who only gets charged, if the blended rate, say, is $150 an hour, they have incentive to use the most junior people possible who they're only paying $80 an hour, and not use the partners who may have the wealth of knowledge. So that's the downside of having the blended.
Well, I think it's the hourly rate. I think the awarding of the points was based on blending the.
Oh, okay, not,
But the actual hourly rate is
Wait.
charged by the person.
okay, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I thought you were saying that you
No,
were
I
paying
think
people
it's
based upon the blended
For the
rate.
awarding of the
Right.
points for the RFP on price.
That's how we can
blended
tell.
it.
Right.
But yeah, if the
Because they
managing
have
director's
separate-
doing the work, he's billing for his rate.
They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7
I
people.
don't know how much you want to get in the weeds of this process. I mean,
I don't know.
I'd be happy to, but I don't know how much other people. Okay. I like this kind of stuff, but okay.
So,
Well, it,
I'll climb up a tree. Look down.
I mean, they have certified internal auditors, the CIAs, who you may want to have someone to. I mean,
okay.
back-
I don't think we should go crazy right now. I think we should follow the statute and hire a firm and follow the statute and,
but I want to make sure we get good people.
yeah.
Well, I think that what we suggested, or what they suggested, is that we have Jane work with them. Here's what we've got. If we have any specific things, get them to Jane, and
by
And-
April 20 something.
Jane and/or
tomorrow morning.
Mitzi, but send them to her, CC them there. So
Okay.
So, and then whatever before the RFP is
I'll be
issued.
sending you an email.
well,
that's
I
what-
think you can CC it to Mitzi too. So
And then before the RFP is issued, just because I mean, that's why it's challenging because of all the more reason you need a committee. Because you're hand-tugged by sunshine, but I do want, I want to see it but this is not necessarily my wheelhouse of expertise. I have enough to be dangerous. And I think you're weighing in and being able to put forth whatever, so we don't get too granular here, but then Jane moving forward with that. Is that reasonable? And then having it before the April, so I think important, the timeline is the key thing for everyone to be aware of. April 29th is when we would want to have the RFP issued, so whatever.
So that means
Like real fast.
Yeah.
That's pretty expedited.
That's like next week.
Right,
Yeah.
so, but I think the framework we have kind of, and we're working off the statute, I don't think it has to be too laborious.
So you're looking at taking it to the board for July 16th.
Yes, because they're supposed to have
Yes.
somebody on staff technically. But
For what?
Did you, this page, then the read ahead?
This is
it has a timeline.
The timeline.
So if we work
And
backwards.
those are estimated, some of these are board dates. I didn't realize I was pulling board
We're not,
dates.
well, we don't have
Depends
it
on
July 16th.
who the committee is and where.
What's our board meeting in
I
July?
think the reason that
Is
she
that our
had
board
board
meeting in
dates
July?
on here for distribution of proposals is because you have to distribute it if you're going to talk about it in a public
And you're all-
setting.
Right.
So I think that's why those are the dates that are on there, is because those are
We might have to-
board
Yes,
dates.
because I was assuming you five were going to be the committee.
Right, which I think,
I want to see the proposal.
I do too.
I want to see the proposal.
So, we don't have a workshop in July, but can we do a special, how long do you think we need?
We close down pretty much in July, don't we?
Well, I think the thought is that the final, you guys would go through all of the proposals at your June workshop.
Okay.
On
In the June
18th.
workshop, correct.
Okay.
But not the July, because there isn't one.
Well, they'll have to go through the proposals individually
Correct.
first.
We would distribute the proposals June 4th. You would each analyze them individually, and then at the workshop, June 18th, is when we would actually kind of go through it, discuss it,
Yeah.
analyze your thoughts on, any rankings.
We
and-
have to do shortlist, or do we?
Well, you don't have to shortlist. You don't have to do a presentation.
Right,
But
okay.
if you want to shortlist and do presentations, I think that is going to take you into August,
Okay,
unless you meet.
Well,
when
if
you're
we
not
need to, we
scheduled
need-
meet. So.
okay.
Is that okay if we don't do it sooner?
I mean, there is no sooner.
Process of, we won't get
even at
dinged by
this-
DOE
This is pushing it.
or sent to court or due process or,
I think our intent will
It's
illustrate where.
pushing it, and we may have to make adjustments based on what the legislature does with the statute.
That's true, too.
I'm thinking we may have a number of policies and things we'll need to change.
So I would think that in any RFP, if we send it out before we get the final and what happens in the legislature, well, because the legislature would have to pass it and then the governor would have
No,
to
but-
sign it, so that we give some wiggle room in there that if there is a change that we can adopt.
There won't be, I'm not aware of any pending change for this particular statute. It was just an addition for the committee. So
who
for
gets
this
it on the
particular, for this, there would be no, that I'm aware of, there's no proposed change
There's no
to this.
staff member sitting on.
It just is, if we were to pick it by July 16th versus July 1st, do we get dinged? I mean,
It was your first convening.
And the only thing I have to check with Art on is whether or not.
I think our intent will illustrate we're clearly trying to follow the letter of the law, so.
Yeah.
Appeal. Try. Okay.
Okay, anything else?
No, so just as a quick clarification, we'll work with Chair Goodwin on developing the RFP, and we will send it to all of you prior to it going on the street. Is that correct?
Yep, so that if
Individually?
anybody wants to change it, then they can work with you directly to ask questions or come up with ideas that require change.
Okay.
Eric?
I just got a phone call from home. I didn't answer it.
Oh, I didn't know you were on the phone. I just want to make sure you were with us. Just teasing. No?
No.
Anything else?
I will send you the specifications if you would like from this manatee. I'll pull out just the specifications and not the boilerplate language.
And there's a lot of stuff in
And
there.
possibly one from SCF too.
Great.
Let me just say, as I listen to the conversation, at some point, we're going to have to reach consensus absent a board action. And would we not be better off placing this on an agenda so that everyone has weighed in, that they have reviewed and had input, as opposed to saying, we'll send our comments to Jane, and when Jane is good. I'm just saying, as far as a board action, you are what is very clear is the board is overseeing this process. And I want to minimize the role of staff and accentuate the role of the board. And it is concerning to me that we would put an RFP on the street based on you having input, but having taken no formal action.
I agree. I'd like to see the proposal, but I didn't think it was possible for me to have that. But this is something I deeply care about.
Me too.
I would like for you to vote on it at the May 7th meeting if you want me to be very direct about what I'm asking for.
May 7th.
So if we're talking about the May 7th meeting, what does that do to the timeline? Let's take a look at that, just so that we're good.
That backs it up by 2 weeks. No, a week. But yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree. Outside, and then, or alternatively, we had to just make a motion to direct you to do so independently. But I worry about sunshine or being like, or putting you in a horrible position, saying, "Why did you put this out there?"
Yeah, and to make sure, I mean, it's not going to be on the consent agenda. It'll be out there as new business, I take. And after you've made your comments, and if something that you wanted that isn't in the RFP or whatever Jane decides on, if there's something there that you don't like, let whoever placed it on there, I would imagine it would be Mitzi, and let them know, or perhaps even have somebody draft an amendment
version,
that could be noticed, as soon as possible to all of us, so that we could look, and then at the meeting, discuss why you want that added. I mean, and perhaps, we'll all say, Jane will have looked at it, and, oh yeah, I guess we missed that. I mean, so that, we follow through. I mean, if we have something written in front of us, what we wanted, because if there's something that either didn't get on that you wanted on, or you thought of something new that we should have on, I'd like something in writing, perhaps possibly before the board meeting, so that we can make an amendment to the RFP that we're going to be voting on the 7th, so that we know how to follow the procedure. Is that in
Yes,
line
as
with what
Richard
we
Corcoran said recently to us, follow the process. And
So give board members a deadline of that Friday at the very latest, before the Tuesday.
exactly right.
Any
Friday before the board meeting.
Well, yeah, we have to have it in advance, and then we have it the Friday before. If there's any changes, get it over to Todd.
Well, I think under the
changes.
proposed timeline that we should have a final draft, if there is such a thing, a final draft by that 29th date. We're prepared to have it on the street, so I assume we can commit to having it to board members, which gives you that full week to provide comments. But I just want to make sure we are all under the understanding it will be under new business.
Yes.
But it will not include a staff recommendation.
Correct.
Because it's not an action
of staff.
So draft to the board by 4/29, comments in advance of the meeting by 5/3.
Final draft.
Final draft.
Final draft.
By 4/29, comments from board members by 5/3, to be discussed 5/7, new business. Correct.
And what we'll do is we'll send out any proposals without comment. We'll just say we've received the following proposed amendments to it to be considered.
Amendment A, B,
So that
C,
we're not
D.
weighing them of saying, should we change the document or not? So we'll issue a document, which is kind of staff's last act on the 29th. Anything we receive from you, we'll simply compile. So be specific in that I wish to change this period, this comma, that phrase, and we'll just simply compile those edits, and then you can work your way through them at the board meeting on the 7th.
Okay, so one last question from me. So normally what happens is the RFP goes out on the street, and interested proposers send questions, either for clarification, they want to look at something, they'll ask, how much have you spent in the past on this, and all these other things. So some of them, obviously, we can answer, but many of them we can't, because they're more about your intent. So do we need another meeting for you to then meet to discuss the questions before we put out an addendum to the RFP to all of the proposers?
And any of your changes that you have thought out of at that time could be issued in the addendum.
It's a long process.
I mean, it's a legit process, yeah.
Yeah.
So again,
if that happens, why don't you work with Jane?
It will happen. I mean, it will happen.
That's
Anytime
usually
you have
how we
RFP.
do it. We work electronically.
And if we need a special meeting, then we'll have to
You'll
do a
call it,
special
yeah.
meeting.
Okay.
No problem.
Are you good with that?
Sure.
You're not in tax season now, right?
No.
If we wait till August, he'll have mini
Okay.
tax season.
We may have to add something in because of,
Special meeting.
yeah.
I'm fine with that.
Okay,
I'm free that day. Doesn't matter which day
Good.
it is.
good. Anything else, Mitzi?
No, that was the only other thing, is they always usually come back with, I mean,
They
what
do.
was
Good
it?
point. We
do have
Manatee
a-
or SCF had 34 questions, so,
We do have a deadline for written questions is May 13th.
and that's
Based
probably
on-
going to have to get backed up because we're not getting it out on the streets till May 7th. So it's not giving them enough time.
Yeah,
Madam Chair?
Anything else, Carol?
no, I'm good.
Eric?
Yeah, but while we have Carol up here, I mean, she doesn't normally get to appear, but she should, because when we get our board packets, I would say half of the stuff that we get involves Carol. And the fact that we don't normally see her is a testament to how good of a job her and her staff does.
Good.
She gets calls from me periodically, and she is able to answer every single one of my questions, and I always threaten her that I'm going to ask you at the board meeting, and she always answers my questions, and she does a really good job of it. So I just want to tell you.
9 bids
Uh-huh.
to you today, 9 bids.
9 bids.
Plus piggybacks.
And I just want to thank you, and hopefully you'll take back the appreciation of the entire board to your staff of
Wow,
how well a
thank
good job
you.
you do.
Yes,
Yes, thank you, Carol, for all you do.
thank you very much.
Great job. Any other questions?
So we'll get together.
Thank you.
Well, we'll talk about more tomorrow. Good, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, actually, I thought, geez, if I retired June 30th, I'd still be in the middle of this.
That's correct. So you're not going to retire. You can't retire yet. No, cannot do that.
And next up, we have our favorite, Mitzi Corcoran and Krista Kurtner, who is sitting in the audience patiently waiting to discuss our budget update.
I told Carol we were going to start calling her the purchasing lady. We have the purchasing lady and the budget lady.
I was thinking it was more
women.
like the three blind mice.
To lady.
Woman.
I prefer to be called a woman.
That's what Bridget just said, too.
Okay.
Man. So, so not much to update you on. Not much has changed, at least for this fiscal year. Not much has changed since the last time we spoke. The only real difference you'll see in our projected results of operations for 18-19 is we had a 25% increase in our property insurance as a result of all of the catastrophes that have happened over the last few years. And as a result, there's about a $125,000 increase for the rest of this fiscal year in property insurance. But it's offset by a transfer from capital. That's what funds our property insurance. So it's a zero net in the general fund, at least. So, but that carries on into 19-20. But for 18-19, there isn't anything different from what you guys have seen in your monthly financial statements for where we're projecting. It's still at 13.1 million deficit, and we still are going to end up just shy of 7.8% based on the old policy. So for 19-20, are you ready?
Sure.
I'm going to turn it over to Krista Kurtner and let her give you an update on 19-20. That's right.
Oh, what fun.
Yeah.
Be nice, she's scared to death.
Okay, so, can you hear me?
Nope.
Okay. No,
Yeah, they can.
Okay. All right. So for the projected budget for 1920,
You're on what page?
oh, I apologize. Page 3.
Page 3.
Yes, ma'am. So what we have in this update is the Senate and the House with the revenues that they're proposing. So overall net, as you guys know, the BSA for the Senate was more generous than the House. The Senate was $149.40 and the House was $38.34. So that obviously translates into, as Eric was saying, this is the less restricted money. So, the other thing that we have done is, based upon the property, we've got a 6% increase in the tax roll for our referendum. That's what we're budgeting off of. We have, as you know already, included the 0.5% increase for the salaries. And there's only the additional positions that you see are only for the police. They are going to increase by 28 positions. Last time we talked, it was less, but since then, we are now going to be staffing the Venice Elementary and Venice High. So you will see that.
I'm sorry, we are going to be staffing Venice?
Yes, ma'am.
So then what happened to the substation?
So, two different issues. The substation will remain. We received communication from Venice that, matter of fact, I had
Venice Police?
correct, that they would rather put their officers out on patrol and in some of their specialty units that they've been unable to staff, and have us take that responsibility. So it's a zero sum on the budget. We're simply moving it from contracted services and increasing the head count in our police department by 3. But that is an action completely of Venice. We gave them the option, and originally they elected to have their officers remain, but they have since come back to us. Matter of fact, I saw Tim here earlier. They were very, very complimentary of Tim and felt like we've got it under control and are comfortable with our officers staffing Venice Elementary and Venice High School.
Great. And then you said it was different. The substation still, I'm sorry, but the substation.
Substation will remain. We hope to have good traffic. They can still have a presence there on the island. We hope that they're in and out of schools both during operations and after hours, but our partnership on that level remains.
Well, that's good to hear that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Matter of fact, is a model for other agencies that we're going to pursue to invite them in.
Oh, no, good question. So that you will see as the change. So the staffing went up, but then the corresponding decrease in purchase services. The benefits, as you know, are going up by 4%, and I apologize, in the narrative at the time that I had this, SCF, Venice, and Dreamers were both listed in the narrative, but as the day that I was creating this for you,
Right.
the article was in the paper. So I missed that one, but I got it out. It's not in the financials anymore.
Dreamers
so
is not in the
Dreamers is not, yes.
Yeah, the financial change is included in your financial information. It just wasn't updated in the narrative.
Yes. And so everything else pretty much stays the same as far as their energy services. FPL said about 2% increase, and everything else is just the same. So if you were to flip the page 4, one thing that, just to give you guys a little bit more detail in each line item, is there's just a slight change in what we project for next year with our ROTC. We had they're going to be going from 10 months to 11 months, and it's a shared cost with federal. We also have, so something that's different is in the state funds, and I know you guys know this, but in the Senate, in the House, the best and brightest is included, so that's why you see salaries going up also. The House also has an appropriation for Summer Learning Academy. It's a small appropriation, but well, we're hopeful for it. And also workforce is going up, which is great. That's much needed. In the local funds, the increase is primarily due to our tax roll. And as far as the transfers, you're going to see that they're going up based upon allowable transfers for the capital fund for software and things. However, the Senate, you'll see, is going down for the charters and their PICO. They're going to be funding it the other way, out of our capital millage.
Which I'm sure all of you are familiar. The PICO allocation to charters from the House, $158 million, and for the Senate was 15. So pretty substantial differential.
Do we? I know. Last year the staff didn't recommend it, but at the board table we ended up taking some of our capital dollars and sharing with the charter. Is that contemplated to do that again?
It is. It depends on the will of the board. I think they're developing the capital program based upon how the law is written currently, which is a proportionate share. And that hasn't necessarily been changed. I think there was some implementing language on the House side that shows it's fully funded by the PICO dollars. I didn't see that on the Senate side. So to me, it would be the impression I would receive is that the Senate's intent is that we would be funding.
I mean, even though I voted against it last year, I still think, if the will of the board, I think that we should try to find out from the board whether they want to do this again, rather than finding out in August, after we voted on it 3 or 4 times.
I agree.
So as we've constructed the capital budget, the various proposals are under the current law, which from a fiscal perspective is us prorating. So it really is the highest dollar value is being maintained there. So, May 3rd will be here before we know it, and we'll know what the law says in that regard. And at that point, we can certainly get with the board and say, here's your obligation. What is your will above and beyond what your obligations are under the law?
We'll also know, too, what the state has done for the schools.
Absolutely. Yep.
So, I mean,
Absolutely.
but I think we were looking at, so this is what they were normally getting, this is what they're going to get this year, and then what do we want? But currently, this is set at that lower amount that we originally started with last year?
30%.
Or the amount that we gave them last year?
For the general fund or the capital fund? For the capital fund, it is set based on law. So it is the full share, like what we did a couple of years ago. So
You mean the full share, so on a...
It's on Pico Pass?
it's the ad valorem millage.
Oh, that was the bigger
Much
amount.
higher amount.
Correct. It's a much higher amount because basically the law as it is written today is set to sunset 6/30. So if there isn't any action on the part of the legislature, we would be obligated to pay. So, of course, we're taking a worst-case scenario in our capital program, and that's why we have those dollars that way. However, if we were to have the House budget with their PICO allocation, it does not include a requirement to spend ad valorem millage in that way, which is the way it was this year.
Well, I
We
would
just
hope
never know
that-
what we're going to end up with.
I would hope that if we go with where, we got to give them the bigger amount, we worked with them last year and said, we worked with you, we helped you out. Maybe we could work with them again to help us on that this year. If that's what happens, I would hope
Well,
that,
if
we would reach out to the charter schools, because we helped them the year before, and maybe they could help us if they gave us our worst scenario.
The whole thing. The whole
It could
thing.
happen.
The whole thing is that there is legislation now that would impact both capital millage and referendum dollars. People like Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach County, and others have a huge liability that they are attempting to make them go back to 2016, 2018, which, is really very distasteful, as opposed to, I think they're using that as a ploy to make it look okay if they do it this year as opposed to going back. Because, it's really painful, because how many charter schools do they have in Miami? A lot. Mm-hmm. So, and the way they had written their referendums, for example, was that you must have art programs and PE and some things that charter schools didn't have. So it was written very, very prescriptive writing. So I don't know, but I don't feel good about that either. I don't really feel good about not sharing everything.
But I don't know that would impact our dollars right now.
They won't impact our dollars,
Right.
but I think that the inevitability is that we'll have to share in both capital and millage, operating millage across the state. It will be determined that, will be done in. Yes, Caroline?
I was sitting in on a charter school meeting last year, and they were not happy with what we gave them last year
I know.
At the final?
at the final.
They had that big year.
The final.
The final decision? No, I received very...
No, I thought they were happy with it.
I
because we
received
gave
good...
what we normally
Where
gave
was that
them.
meeting, Todd?
I don't know that I'd use the word happy, but content that where we ended up. Our charter school operators in Sarasota find themselves almost at odds with charter schools around the state, because a PICO pass-through is much more favorable to places like Miami-Dade and other places around the state. And when you look at funding per student on the capital side, I think if you polled charter schools statewide, they would prefer that money come out of the state coffers. Here in Sarasota, the state allocation fell less than what we were doing on a proration, so they would be the ones that would say, no, we'd rather be prorated at the local level. And so where you landed last year was a PICO pass-through, which fell short of their prorated capital dollars, and then this board ultimately decided to supplement that with something that was of your own discretion. And so, but even with that contribution, did not get them to where they were in past years. And so,
But they had that huge bump.
yes, and this year would return them to their prior peak funding. Yes, they would return to their bump of the past. Yes. And how they forecast their revenues, I have absolutely no idea.
But we have said throughout this year over and over again, because we don't know what it was and we didn't want to find ourselves in the same situation, that we'll have to find some balancing out, but that obviously we're not flowing in the money either. So I think hopefully that has been understood, that we're doing the best we can for all of our students.
So that is what is happening with the revenues. So if you flip to page 5, we can talk about.
Before we leave the revenue,
Yes, ma'am.
we went up with FSBA to Tallahassee, and it just so happened the day I was up there was the same day that my op-ed, is it an op-ed guest editorial showed, and through our lobbyist, I had heard that Senator Galvano was very pleased with that. He said because he really thought that putting that additional money, $350 total FEFP towards each per student, in what is it, 159 or something like that, for the base student allocation, that he really thought that he would get more thanks or more support from school districts and from the public, and said that he was glad to see it, but was a little disappointed he didn't hear more. So I would encourage other people to, call his office, send him and Senator Gruder's also, our senators, let them know that we appreciate and we support the Senate position. Oh, and by the way, could you give us the Summer Learning Academy dollars too? It wouldn't hurt, but as he said, don't you always tell us to give him something nice before you ask him for something?
He retweeted you. He was.
And I can say, I think on this board, I'm the person who's shown the most appreciation to Senator Gruters. You could ask him.
I know that's true.
I know that.
I don't even have to have your comment. I know that's true.
Well, I almost think that the funding is might be above his pay grade, but I know that Senator Galvano has really stood up to help bring up the BSA for our public schools, and deserves our thanks.
That's great. So go to page 5 for the expenditures, the appropriations. And what you'll see here is that there is a decrease in salaries from what we expect this year to be to what next year is going to be for preliminary. The increase in the House and the Senate is obviously due to the best and brightest. And for the employee benefits, those are also going up.
I'm sorry. On the best and the brightest, currently, it's always been a bonus. But I understand there's some discussion about sending it to us to add to their
Salary. Yes.
That's very concerning.
It's been proposed, and it's
Unless the funding doesn't continue, then it becomes.
Well, yeah, if the funding doesn't continue, then how they get a salary cut. But I would imagine, well, we can't just do it. I mean, don't we have to, I mean, you can't change a teacher's salary without going through negotiations, though, correct?
Correct.
So.
Yes, absolutely. And the cost gets much higher because now you have, on a bonus, there's no benefits.
Yeah, so now you have to pay bonus and you have to pay
FRS
credit, which also went up by, 2.5%. And so all of the other components, workers' comp and everything will also be added to it. So it'll increase on the employer side more, which may leave less for salary piece versus a bonus.
Well, another thing to be watching.
And the employee benefits went up with our FRS, as Mitzi just said, and then our workers' comp went up slightly, and the medical went up by the 4%. And the employee benefits really went up a lot more than what you see salaries, because of the fact that salaries or positions that we're adding weren't as high as the benefits that are incurred with them. Like the police force has a higher FRS rate of like 25%. Yeah, it's a
That's
lot.
a lot.
Purchase services, you'll see that went up because of the property insurance, like we talked about. Also, it went up. It went down, which you don't see, but that's for the Venice Police Department. And then in the Senate side, it went up because they are allocating extra dollars to the mental health, so that's just kind of a flow through for us. Purchase services charters went up. There's where I was able to change that narrative, and it's only got SCF as the additional charter in it. The energy services is going up, as we talked about, and materials and supplies. There's no change since the last session, and neither with the capital outlay. So basically, no really changes to the other parts for what we have at this point in time. So then we have our totals on page 6, and also the graph down at the bottom only shows where we're anticipated to end for this year for the 7.79% of the fund balance unassigned. So what you'll also see at the right above the graph is the financial condition ratio percentage that the state uses. So you can see how different it is for whether it's our current policy or that ratio.
2%.
Yeah, it's about 2%. And you can see with the Senate, that fund balance is pretty close to what we currently are, 7.5. So obviously, as you were saying, the BSA makes a huge difference. So if you want to flip to the next page, which doesn't have a number on it, but it starts going into all the financial spreadsheets. This is just how all of the tables were made. So you can see on the far right, you can see the revenues and transfers. You can see in the center of the page what the deficiency is with the different types of funding. So you can see the projected actual for this year. We're projecting to come in at 13 million under. Level funding is 12 million under, and then the House is 8, and the Senate is 3. So that's with what those current BSAs and different allocations are. And then down below again is where you can see how the different ratios happen as far as whether we're doing our current fund balance policy or the financial condition ratio. So that's pretty much all I have that's just the detail of the information in the tables. If you want to, Eric had asked me, oh, yes, sir.
Eric.
So can we go to the comparative statement of salaries?
Sure.
Let's go, I'm going to be going all the way to the far right.
Okay.
So I'm going to be looking at the column starting at the 2018-19 projected budget. That's the fourth one in, as you cross from the right, going to the left.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Okay. And then the first row is teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember that when I first got on the board, we had a lively discussion about position control. Mm-hmm. And then you know, when I got to work in your department today, you had me working on position control. And so I saw that you decided how many teachers, you know, each school got based upon how many students, what type of students they got. And so, so it's irrespective. I'm sorry. It's based upon the needs of the school and the needs of the district is how we divide them up. And so I'm curious how these numbers change depending on the budget, is because if we allocate this many teachers to this many schools, mm-hmm. I mean, why would the total value change?
So if you look at 1920, it's going down by 2 million. Part of that is attrition. Part of it is because there was a reduction of 8 teaching units at high schools because they were averaging, 18 to 1? 18 to 1 in core classes, where class size amendment requires 25 to 1.
So that would explain why the projected budget to the level budget, why that goes down to 2 million.
Correct.
I'm with you. I got you. But then as I move over to the right again, the number goes up because the House budget, because you're getting more money. That would lead.
No, it's best and brightest.
It's because of best and brightest. So, and then when I go over to the Senate,
It goes down because they didn't give as much to best and brightest
okay.
as the House.
So then when I go to teachers' aides, is that are they subject to best and brightest also?
No.
And so we're not going to add any more teachers' aides to the. That's why they're all the same.
Their status.
That's
Actually, it goes down $200,000.
Yeah, the aides, and that's just based upon people coming and going. But the aides at this point are status quo. We put out all of our staffing allocations, and we've gotten them back from the schools, and they're working on them right now. So do I anticipate that it may change? Yes, it may, because they waiver things. And also, as far as ESC is primarily where the aides come in, and Sonia gets the evaluations, and she goes through and determines what.
I just have a couple more lines.
Sure.
Next one. They get, I want to say they get more and more important as we go down, but they get more and more highlighted. Guidance counselors. I mean, the needs for guidance counselors grown over the past year, but so we're not
No, it's status quo.
status quo for guidance counselors.
And don't forget, when you're looking at projected actuals here, those have wavered positions in them. And when we go back and do level, we have to put everything back to the way that the district says the formulas are. So will you see guidance counselors probably increase when it comes back again because schools are purchasing them? Yes, or wavering.
So let's go to the I don't want to go down every single level, but so we'll stop at the next one. And that one's psychologists and social workers. So I would expect it over the course of the past year for that number to go up significantly.
No, and also
I know it did not. I know.
also there's also a
Contracted.
But I would expect we'd have more. We would be hiring more psychologists, more social.
well, remember it's status quo, and also something that was put into place back in the recession is that every time they're paid on an instructional plus 7.1% salary line, and at 11 months. So every time one of them leaves through attrition, they become 10 months.
The point I'm trying to make, I guess it's getting lost, is that we're continually deficit spending, but the areas like psychologists, social worker, teachers' aides, guidance counselors, teachers, that's not going up. And it would be fine, you know, if we were going in deficit and we were increasing the number of psychologists and social workers, and I know this is outside your purview, but just as a school board member, it'd be more palatable to me that we were deficit spending if we were spending the money on those type of things. So that was my point of this exercise.
We added a little bit in behavioral specialists, I know, last year, and in behavioral technicians.
Correct.
But not enough. We need them in elementary schools. I know that is probably, according to what I've heard from Pupil Support Services, one of the most important jobs that we need. We need those people who, hands-on, are working with students who have real severe issues.
Correct, and there is a contractual difference between a social worker and a homeschool liaison. And so our increase of services to students through the homeschool liaisons at our Title I elementary schools would not show under psychologists and social workers. Although they have similar job descriptions, they are two separate job descriptions. And this does not account for the increase in contracted services, of which we have delivered an increase of services specifically in the area of psychology through contracts. But they are not employees of the district, which would show on the lines that Mr. Robinson has highlighted.
But it does worry me. I'll take Garden, for example, which is no longer a Title I school this year, barely, but it still has needs. And so we're taking their homeschool liaison away from them. Simply because of Title I, even though they still have those same needs, the homeschool liaison still, is needed there for those kids. And because they're simply not a Title I school, even though they still have that need, we're going to cut that from the Garden Elementary School.
But, I will just say this, Eric. If we fund them for every elementary school,
we would have a better school district.
We'd have a better school district. I agree with you. But if they're not, we should be happy that they've moved from being Title I to not being Title I, but I think we can't pick and choose some favorites here. And I really find that the area that I think is most necessary is in the mental health services, the home school liaisons, and all those other connective tissue that we put in between our staff and our parents and our students. And those things are really, I think, needed to be increased at some point in time when the budget allows. Bridget?
Well, so just stemming off of the statements that were made, because I agree, and I'm not sure with I agree that I want to see more financials, more money going towards directly to the schools, as we talked about deficit spending. But so you mentioned contract services. Are we putting additional, I don't see any increase in contract services. Are we putting additional resources into?
Contract services is reduced by $2.5 million for the SRO contracts. So the other
right, so take that out. Right, I understand. I'm not looking at the aggregate. I'm asking specifically to these kind of supportive services that were just referenced. Are we actually funneling more dollars into those?
The mental health allocation is all contracted.
Okay, that's
based upon the
I think I want to answer your question very directly. We are not proposing a change under contracted services in the area of mental health for 1920. There was a significant change in 1819, but there is no change contemplated for 1920. I believe that was your question.
Okay. Well, then the second part is, and I don't know the details on Garden, but when we look at, you said I hope school liaisons being taken out, when we look at staffing allocation, are we looking at only I know Title I dollars help support that cost, but are we also looking at the circumstance, kind of handing off the email that you'd sent over to us that broke it down? Were we using that data, and that's only a smidgen piece, to kind of support what that school needs, despite it not having the Title I designation anymore?
And so we do not do that through position control, no, but through the contracted services, we have the ability to move those services around. And so we use staffing formulas. And so Title I is a different staffing formula than in our non-title schools. So if you're highlighting the change at Garden, it's because they've lost their title status, which overall is a good thing for them, but they're also losing some supports that come with being a title school. There are other positions that will come out of their budget that they were buying through Title I. Is all of those Title I budgets ultimately buy positions, although Garden's Title I allocation was not what you might see at a Tuttle, Gosio, MAE.
Okay.
Eric?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I was clear in what I was saying, because Chair Goodwin said something she'd like to do if the budget allows. I just want to point out, the psychologists and social workers, it doesn't matter whether we get the more money for the House or the Senate. It stays the same. It's not like if we get more money, we're going to put more, this budget puts more money into psychologists and social workers. It keeps it the same.
Right.
And then your comment about Garden, about picking favorites, it's not that I'm saying let's add a homeschool liaison to a particular school because I like it. It's the fact that we're cutting a homeschool liaison from a particular school that clearly has the need. Now, you got to remember, the Title I funding is tiered. Depending on what percentage of your free and reduced lunch, the more you have, the more money you get. And so they were barely a Title I. So the amount of Title I funding they were getting was very minimal. So their cut in the funding in Title I, I don't think that's enough that should preclude them, because they still have the need. In cutting homeschool liaisons from a school that has need, I want to enforce it. I'm not saying add. It's the fact that we're cutting this service and we're not increasing the service no matter how much budget we get from the House or the Senate. Even though Ms. Brown has talked about how much money we get from the Senate, even if we get that money from the Senate, we're proposing not to expend additional money in there.
Caroline?
I've watched us through the years go through this. This is nothing new. I've watched Tuttle lose their title funding. I've watched all of the schools lose it, as either because the funding didn't come down or because they no longer qualified for it. So this is nothing unusual, Eric. And you are partial to Venice, the Venice community. And you do look out for the Venice community. You say that to us all the time.
I look after them. I look after Booker. I look after the low socioeconomics.
Please don't interrupt me.
But you're talking to me.
No, I'm talking, so please don't interrupt me. I I go to church and I have to pray all the time just because I can't stand your comments. And I'm not allowed to not stand his comments. Anyway, so this is not to say they won't be given extra funding through contracted services. I mean, wait until you see what happens, because there's money in contracted services.
Shirley?
I let Mitzi answer first.
I just wanted to say, you're not going to see any additional staffing. It'll be exactly the same because we are deficit spending. So if there's additional funding, it's just reducing the amount of the deficit as of this budget. It will be different once we get all of the requests from the schools and their waivers and, you know, exchanging this out for that and whatever. So the numbers will be different next month, I would think. Hopefully by next month, because we're doing staffing by the end of the month, so it has to be. So there may be some changes, but as of today, there were no, we just did a status, it was the direction of the superintendent, it's a status quo budget, and that's it. So that's why there are no additions.
Shirley?
Again, this is the level funding. You know, we're not making changes, we're not making cuts. And I think that's a decision that, you know, I'd like to discuss at the next time. But I'm looking at another one where the comparative statement of employee benefits. If you look back on the 2015-16, I'm looking at the retirement funding. It went from 23 million and then 22, and then it dropped down to 10 million. I'd imagine that was because when that retirement amount is based on what the legislature tells us what the amount is.
I'm sorry, Shirley. I'm just now on the page.
You're on page what?
It doesn't have a
there's
page
no
number.
page
We
number.
apologize.
Please give us page numbers.
I know. I apologize.
It says comparative statement of employee benefits.
It's towards the end. It's after the salaries.
This one.
It has a graph on the bottom. It's right.
Yeah, and there's a graph on the bottom, and you know.
So I see under retirement.
And when, well, I guess when you look, I need to look at that. But like in 2009 and 2010, they reduced the amount of the FRS contribution. But I mean, that's what that was. I think they reduced the amount of what we had to pay into the FRS because we were going through a economic.
It required
downturn.
a 3% contribution of employees.
That was the 3% from employees.
So it reduced what the employer paid, and then it has progressed up again.
And did that 3% go back into the retirement fund or into general revenue?
It goes to FRS. So every time you get a paycheck, 3% of your paycheck goes to FRS, and then the employer portion for next year is 8.47. So it's a total of 11.47% being deposited on your behalf for retirement.
And okay, so then it was down there at 10 million, then it started to creep up, and then it went from 11 million to 16 million, and now 17, now it's up to 21 million. Is that because the state is increasing the FRS contribution rate, or are we increasing our overall salary, or? I mean,
well, it's a combination of different things, but I will say that I think in 13-14, that was when FRS or the state started funding what's called the unfunded actuarial liability. It's called UAL. So now your contribution rate in FRS is made up of two different components, your current year funding and your unfunded liability, so that they can have enough money to meet their obligations in the future. So that was, I think, became part of the law. You know,
well, I know, and
knowing what happened in 13-14, but I'm pretty sure
kind
that's
of what I'm trying to point out is you know, one of those things where we move the little shells around, and how retirement funding went from 10 million. I mean, it dropped to 10 million because employees had to start putting in 3 million, and then it climbed in what, 5 or 6 years, you know, to more than double.
Yeah.
Even though the funding didn't increase, and in fact, when you look at from 19 to 19, well, we better go to 17, 18 to 18, 19. That's the current year, right? Yeah, it increased 1.2 million. Now, that increased even though we were, and this comes out of that 47 cents per student increase, correct?
Absolutely.
So when you say you get 47 cents per student and you multiply that times 49,000, or 42,000, and then you go, oh, wait a minute, but 1.2% million of that increase you have to put into the retirement.
Correct.
So talk about understanding the FEFP. There's other points of it too. So even though you get a little bit more money in the base student allocation, we got hit with having to pay more for the retirement. And when we started doing that unfunded actuary, and we're one of the best funded retirement systems
yes.
in the country.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're not up to 100%, but we're still, I mean, aren't we over 80%?
I think so, yeah. We're one of the best in the country.
We're one of the best in the country. But the legislature at this is saying, well, they're giving us less money, and over the last years, they have been increasing the amount of money we've had to put into the retirement system.
Correct.
Now, when they increase our FRS contribution, do they also increase their FRS contribution that they have to pay for their employees too?
Correct.
It's across the board, so we're
Correct.
all paying more.
Yes. It's every participant in the FRS.
Thank you.
Eric?
Now I can address Ms. Zucker's comments. I do, I live in Venice, and so I have parents come to me in Venice. And so naturally that's where I'm at. That's where parents come to me. But I do want to make sure that people understand. I don't normally go into this, but apparently there's a miscommunication here, a misconception. I've also cared about Northport. I've been down there by the Social Black Belt, Emotional Wellness Program. I was from ground one, I think before I was even on the board, teamed up with the union for SRA at M.E. Booker. I've funded scholarships at Booker High. I have done things through the breadth and width of this county. But yes, I do live in Venice. I'm not shy about that. And so parents come to me up in Publix and say things to me when I'm in Venice. So I just want to make sure that that's highlighted. And when I was talking about social workers and homeschool liaisons, we were talking about district-wide. And I'm sorry if you don't like those type of comments, but I'm concerned about those people. I know Ms. Goodwin is. I'm concerned about what impact it has on those people and those children, regardless of where that location is. And I know that you've sat and watched it by, but I'm not the kind of guy, I think everybody knows this by now, I'm not a sit and watcher kind of guy. I mean, if I see something, I think I'm on the board, and it's not in my DNA to just sit there and watch it go by. I think it's not only my right, it's my responsibility to say what I need to say and to help, give input where I see things are at. Yes, I'm in the minority, but I'm not just going to sit here and watch it go by. If I believe that we can do something to help people, if I think that we can do something to help these children, I don't care where they're at. I don't care if they're in Venice. I don't care if they're Northport. I don't care if they're north of Fruitville or south of Honore. It doesn't really matter to me. It matters to me that some of these children, don't have a good home life. Some of these kids need this extra help. So when I hear that homeschool liaison is being cut, I don't care where it's at, and maybe because of where in my locality I'm more susceptible to parents coming to me and talking to me about it. I'm not going to just ignore it. I'm not just going to sit there and watch that go by. And I understand you hate those type of comments, but it's not in my DNA makeup to just sit there and say, oh, well, to these people. I think it's part of my responsibility as a board member. I know we all think our responsibility as board members are different, and that's fine. We can all view our responsibilities different. I'm just telling you how I view my responsibility.
Thank you.
And I have been trying for years to get more psychologists and social workers in the schools. And it's known, it's on record for doing that. But I also understand what happens when the funds are cut for those programs. And if we are, Title I funding was lowered. That's why programs don't stay.
I was going to say, we've had a lot of things cut in the last 4 years.
Yeah.
I look at the cost of our overall employee benefits, which is $72 million in 2015-16, and now we're looking at upwards of $89 million. Our employees need to know that those are hard licks, and those are things that we do because we care about them, but those are real benefits to them. I worked where I paid my own insurance, my own health insurance, or a portion of it. We've been able to sustain that and not do that here. But we also have had our property taxes cut, and we've had our required local effort cut. Mitzi tells me $94 million in 3 years' time that she's computed without looking at compounding. And those things are big hits, and they hit us in the head with the 2x4 when they do things like that. So it's no wonder that we're having some problems. But I think one of the biggest problems that we have is the support staff. And back in 2007 to 2010, there was a lot of cuts. We cut out librarians, which we only had at the high school level, which I've never been happy with that whole issue. But the things that we cut, the aides and other things that we cut, what? Nurses, which has always been a big thing to me. But we cut these people during the recession, and we never brought any of them back. And now we're using contract services, Sonia tells me, because she doesn't dare hire these people because of this consideration of this being part of the budget and will it last. So, you know, it's no wonder that we've had these problems, because we have been challenged, because we have had several declines that really make a difference and impact our budget, our operations budget, considerably. Yes, Shirley.
I think that, you know, we're talking about what our priorities are and what we want to see in the budget. And I think we need to look back on page 6 when we talk about what the preliminary budget is, you know, 18, 19, and when you add in what the House or the Senate, and we'll probably fall one where in between, and I think it goes back to how we calculate that fund balance. I mean, if we have priorities where we're talking about having homeschool liaisons or people working. I mean, I would like to see that, you know, we give our aides, especially at Oak Park, more. I've been talking about it's I think unconscionable that we have employees making less than $12 an hour. I mean, I'd like to see that we give our bus drivers. We've been talking about them for years, and some of these other people that we look at putting some of those in, and. You know, and I'd like to be able to give our, you know, if our teachers are going to be getting raises from the legislature, that we look at those people who aren't getting anything. I mean, so I think one of the things that we need to be looking at, and maybe looking at direction, you know, to the superintendent, and if we don't agree on it, I'd like to see a budget come back where we can look at, you know, the next time before we have to vote, where we have one when here's the numbers from the state. And here's what we can do if we use the old balance, and like as Caroline pointed out, when we were putting that money away for charter schools, and we really, I don't think we need to be including the charter school funding in the amount that we have to put away in our unreserved funds, and using the financial condition ratio that the state has used. I would like to see brought to us when we're looking at, when we get the numbers from the state, when we're looking at our budgets, I would like to have a budget brought to us showing, okay, this is what we can do if we use this financial condition ratio as the state uses, and this is the one that our policy says we have to use. So we look at the two, and perhaps this is where you can listen to what we've been talking about what some of our priorities are. And perhaps maybe we let the superintendent know, well, my priority would be, you know, raising the salaries for bus drivers and for the aides, and especially the aides at Oak Park, you know, and raising everybody to at least a $12, you know, if not $15, or, you know, looking at that and some of those things, and perhaps looking where these schools need the homeschool liaison. Look at some of those things and you know, let the superintendent know what your priorities are if we were to use that. Or if your priorities is, no, I don't want you to use that money. I want us to hold on to the Senate. Not only that, but if we use that, we're going to have to cut someplace. What we've already put through, we're going to have to cut the level funding somewhere. And I want you to cut in this place or that place. I think that's kind of what we're going to, I mean, wouldn't that be the next step? I mean, you have to put a budget together.
Well, May 3rd is the next step.
Besides the level funding, yep. I mean, the next step is, okay, here's the budget that we're going to be looking at. And my druthers would be is that we would look at a funding that we could fund some of those by using that financial condition ratio. And I've told you what my priorities are. and it's probably more spread out across, but if there's other priorities that we'd like to see funded, like a homeschool liaison at a school, or and like I said, rather than pick out a school, say this is the level that we want to fund these at, and say this is where I want, and or if that's not what you want to cut a position here or there, that we're too heavy here, too heavy there. Let the superintendent know where you are on those things so that we can get a budget that that you might be agreeable to, or looking at where you want to see cuts that we have now or want to see additions. I mean, because that's the next process in the budget. Am I right? Or
Well, the next process in the budget is for the legislature to complete their work and the governor to sign the budget, and that way we can get from 3 columns to 1. We're dealing with really 3 different budgets, and so once you have a budget, then you can have conversations, understanding you can only spend it once. And so, do you want to increase salaries across the board? Do you want to do it in a targeted way? Do you want to add positions? Are you concerned about deficit spending and want to increase the reserves? Those are all things that can be done with the dollars, but understand each dollar can only be spent once. And so I think it's important that we continue to follow what's happening in the legislature. And then, yes, we'll come back and say, okay, now it's not a House column, a Senate column, and a governor's column.
Right.
It is, here's our budget. Now let's make some hard decisions about next year. I think some of it should happen here in a workshop. I think some of it should happen in executive session because there are implications for bargaining.
Agree. Bridget?
Well, kind of hinging off of what both Shirley and Todd said, I think it's, and I don't want to speak for you, but my takeaway was there are major priorities we've heard this board talk about, especially as it relates to mental health. I recognize some of them not represented here because they are being funded through contracted services, but over the course of a year or so, we are deficit spending when we'd like to make sure the classroom areas are really where those deficit dollars are going versus anywhere else. I mean, that's what my takeaway was. And so when we look at the recalculation, I don't think it's any surprise. I do not support the recalculation in general because I want to make sure we're having serious conversations, and I don't want to cut anywhere. I mean, to Shirley's point, I don't want to say, hey, this is where we want. Nobody wants to have that conversation, but we are forced with it, especially if it were up to me completely, is to put a ironclad fence around the classrooms and find anywhere else that we can cut there, be first and foremost, because whether, and I pray that we have some, my sense from the legislature is we'll be somewhere in between. I think we'll have some BSA increase. I think there's going to be strong categoricals in there as well. But I do believe we'll have some BSA increase, and hopefully we can offer some things, but it certainly isn't the same situation we've been in the past when it talks about across the board raises. I think we've offered some great raises in the last couple of years, but we also have to look at some really challenging discussions. And I don't know that any of these budgets, I mean, even if we get the Senate, we're not flowing in money, especially for recalculating something. So the deficit discussion has to happen. And it's not so much just on priorities. I mean, it is, but I'll say my priority is classroom, like cut and dry, make it very simple. That's the starting point. And that was my takeaway, what Eric said. I have one question, and then I'm going to stop. Just as we drill down, and this would make a tiny dent. It's a nothing burger as far as, sorry, I say that a lot. He makes fun of me. Why are our legal fees so they're increased, legal services on comparative statement of appropriations by object, no page number, sorry.
Irony.
But our legal fees have gone up, 35, 40%. I'm not a mathematician, I'm a calculator, human calculator, so you do that. But and then we have the trend continuing. Now I do see in 16, 17 it was bumped up a slight bit, but we went from 356 budgeted to actual 628, and then we trend out for that. What are our legal fees going up for?
So we run those off of actuals, and so that's our consumption of legal services. And so it ranges everything from collective bargaining to defensive suits and, day-to-day advice and counsel. And so that's the trend line, and that's how we project into future years. We try to figure out, are there one-off events that happen in a year that don't have to be accounted for in a following year, or is that the new trend?
So we evaluate them, see what the trends are. I mean, if there's one litigation case, right, that spends additional dollars, we know that's
Then
kind of
we
an
consider that to be
anomaly.
a one-off.
Right, but then if there's due process, ESE, something like that, that's causing us to spend more dollars, are we looking at those trends? Is that something we can,
Yep.
are we sensing that it's geared towards one specific area when you reviewed them?
I don't know that you can attribute it to any one thing. I mean, there are a number of
A lot of employee legal fees related to employees, lots of legal fees related to collective bargaining.
Okay.
There were also some legal fees in regards to a public record
record.
lawsuit that we had to pay
Yep.
this year.
And our policies and having Art.
Yeah, and then we had all the policies that we,
Okay.
but yeah, we looked at, we had a lot of that,
It's
but,
got a fee.
you know, so I'm thinking some of those things we might not have to expend into the next year again, because or are we going to be looking at having to spend all the money like we did on the policies and on those suits?
I don't think, I mean.
Well, we certainly hope to underperform that number, and so it's a projection. I certainly hope our legal fees go down, but we have to
Yeah,
be
but we're
prepared
still
to.
talking about maybe $100,000. I mean, but because I think she's right. That's probably.
Well, Art is looking right now at the policies that we may need to add from legislation from last year and then this year in terms of safety and security, making sure that all those shalls are covered. And then, of course, you have this criminal grand jury in Broward County, which has been assembled to criminally go after school boards and superintendents. And, having someone available to us in that instance of a criminal lawyer nature and so forth. So there were some things that have been increased that will be there that we didn't have before.
Do we get rid of our policy, because it's our going to,
Subscription service, no, we
Yeah.
still have a service that updates, and so.
are we duplicating, or are they still necessary?
No, we've reset the
statutory
baseline
updates.
with ART, but then we send our new policies to them, and then they say, here's changes that are needed based.
And then we will change them this
Correct,
time
so we
around.
don't have to, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Anything else?
Good job, Krista.
Lots of fun.
Good
Lots
job,
of
budget
fun.
lady.
Thank you.
I had a question when we were talking about staffing levels and everything.
Sure.
One of the emails that came from that went to our employees from the union talked about the percentage of increase in the number of administrative positions. And I know when we were talking about the AP positions, now when we put them in, a lot of them weren't so much new people in there. I mean, I know there were a lot of teachers that were, out of field, out of place or whatever, that were sitting there doing the job of the AP, but not getting paid for it, because when we were not adding those kinds of things. So when we added that number, it wasn't really as many as we had, because they were teachers. What is that called? Teachers out of field, out of something that.
Teacher on special assignment.
On special assignment. I don't know how many of those were really teachers on special assignment.
I think you're referring to our administrative intern program.
Correct.
Yes. And how many of them, I mean, how many new principals of APs were really new people from outside, or were they people that we just had inside that we changed? And then also when we added administrative positions, how many of that had to do with safety and security? Did we have any of, where else would these administrative positions come from?
Sure. So our sergeants and above are considered administrative within the police department. And so the increase that you see in the 1920 year is attributed to the increase in the sergeants and the adding of the lieutenant positions. In fact, what we workshopped at our last workshop within the police department.
So that is the only administrative additions for 1920.
Eric.
It goes up from 138 to 155. I'm on general fund. If you had a number,
That's the filled, though. That's not budgeted.
It would be page 9.
It's filled.
That's the filled, not the
versus
budgeted.
Well, I don't know that I've got my.
Well, I got
is
actual
that comparative
field.
statement of positions?
It would be.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. In managers, it goes from 138 to 155.
Filled versus budgeted.
That's your actual filled versus the budgeted.
So why
the
would you
variance
budget for?
The budget in the month, I mean, the
You don't
column
see
to your
the
left is the
budgeted.
budgeted.
that you're looking at to compare to.
So we're working off 138 managers. So why would we? I would like. So can we take this budget down to 138 and go hire some social workers?
Well, there may be a vacancy
Yeah.
in a position.
138 to 155.
And in that line item is various positions. They're not all administrative positions. They are classified people that are career advisors. There are instructional program specialists that we were talking about there and there as well.
Hodgepodge.
Yeah, it's a variety of people that are on around
Well,
the same
I thought you
salary.
just said the only increase was from safety and security.
But you're not comparing.
Administrative positions.
Yeah,
It
you're
goes up
looking at.
17 people.
So if you look at the 18-19 amended budget, which is 151.4, and you look at the 19-20 budget, which is 155.4, you'll see the addition of 4 positions.
I was looking at actual.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the budgeted positions. There may be valid vacancies included in there. There may be a teacher or a specialist who's out on maternity leave and not working, the position's not filled. So I'm just saying, so if you're going by budgeted to budgeted, there's 4 positions, which were the 5 new positions from the police force, less Chief Grahowski's position from this year. So it's minus
That's it.
1
Just-
plus 5, and it's all safety and security. And that's it on the administrative staff in the entire school district.
Bridget?
But interesting, if you just look at the trend, though, starting in 15-16, move over, the increase, again, I'm not a human calculator, so the percentage escapes me here, but the increase on manager super specialists continues to trend pretty upwards. Not at the same rate as if you look at some other areas, teachers, aides.
But you're looking at filled versus budgeted, because like you said, a filled position, I mean,
All right,
you
well,
can have a
actual,
budgeted
just look at- yeah.
position that has somebody
Actual
out,
filled.
not
But-
actually, on leave or something like
The
that,
trend is
correct?
the addition of the career advisors 2 years ago.
Okay.
That's part of it. I'm trying to think of what the other ones are off the top of my head, but
There's just a variety of positions that are in there. Like I said, it's probably split a third for classified, instructional, and administrative. And administrative people, like you're saying, are like the safety and security people. They're people who wouldn't trend in on the higher level administrative positions because those are all listed below, like your APs.
And we're working
Yeah.
on segregating this out. This is a 25-year-old spreadsheet.
I was just gonna ask, can we pull those out?
Trust me. But everything runs together and ties together and formulates together. So to move it and break it all apart, this web is pretty difficult. We're trying, but it is a whole lot of crazy in that line.
So
We will
Many
not
moving
have-
parts.
We will not have a 100% fill rate in 1920. And so to say we're going to go from 138 to 155 assumes that we're going to have a 100% fill rate, which we've had never. And so
But-
the change in budget is
And this is
154,
position
excuse me, 151 to 155.
But when you see the actual, if you assume the actual filled, the vacancies are consistent over time. I mean, from taking Ms. Ziegler's point, actual filled to actual filled goes up 20% from 15-16 to 18-19 in managers.
So if you go back historically to the 16-17 budget, we did a package that increased the number of assistant principals, increased.
separate.
No, we know.
No.
But there were many other positions.
Right.
There were 118 additional positions that year.
Right. And the great majority of them were not administrative, but that's where you got an increase in read and recovery. You got an increase in homeschool liaisons. And so, yes, there was a change in staffing in that year. There has been no increase in staffing since that year. I mean, you've seen some marginal increases, but there was not a package of increases like you saw in that year.
So that would be under the manager, supervisors, and specialists, like you mentioned, guidance counselors, et cetera. But I see a different
Career
category for them.
advisors would be in that line.
So
Yeah, it's career advisors. They're SSP 12s. Those are in that line item.
okay.
But is that where the growth is?
Well, for the 1 year, it definitely was because we added a bunch of those. Like I said, it's a variety of positions. There's instructional program specialists that are in there, so anytime those get increased, those go on that line.
17, 18 to 18, 19, you had the 3 sergeants and the chief for 18, 19.
It's kind of where if it doesn't fit in the other ones, it just goes into that. Yes,
Administrators and higher level classified and undetermined.
This is refilling some of those positions that when times were lean, we were cutting. We were cutting at management positions quite a lot. But if you're looking at, because you have to remember that most of these other, until you get to 18, 19, those are actual filled. And if you look at up on the total instructional, the original budget for teachers is $33.55, and the amended budget is $33.55, but the actual filled is $31.91. So that's the difference between how many teachers we say we're going to have and how many we actually have in those positions. Some of those positions, like you said, are teachers that are home on maternity leave or what other leave or unfilled for one reason or another. So, and that, I think that kind of skews this because they're actually filled versus what we plan to have. You know, it might be interesting to go back, you know, when we started making all those cuts, when we cut back on those types of positions. This is how many we cut, and this is how many we restored, or something else. You know, because you didn't have the benefit of being here when we were making all those cuts to administration to keep them out of the classroom. But there's definitely a difference between a budgeted position and a filled position, because when you're looking at the budget, when they're getting down to the bottom, they have to put them in the filled positions because somewhere else in the substitute bucket is going up on those positions. Because when you've got a teacher that's out, you fill that position with a substitute. So.
But to Ms. Brown's point, the instructional, she just pointed out, is going up 3%, and the managers filled went up 20%.
But you're talking about gross numbers. I mean, when you're talking, it takes a lot more. I mean, look at it takes a lot more when you're talking
I was
about
talking percentages.
3 million. Well,
I wasn't talking about gross numbers. I was talking about percentages.
when you look at percentages, when you're looking at smaller amounts.
But I wasn't talking about gross numbers.
Right. When you add 100 to 3,000,
right,
it's a much smaller number when you add 100 to.
And that's why I didn't do that. That's why I said percentages.
That's what I'm saying. When you say percentages, when you add 100 to 3,000, it's a much smaller percentage than if you add 100 to 1,000. So when you're looking at a smaller,
that's why I use percentages.
That's why percentages look off. Okay. But I'm not. But we're talking different languages.
Okay. Anything else? Thank you both.
No brainer.
Krista, great job. We didn't eat you. We didn't bite you, did we?
Nope. Thank you for being kind, everybody.
Thank you for being here.
Yes, I'll come back.
Thank you for doing a great job.
Thanks.
And you too, Mitzi. Thank you. Thank you for always doing such a great job. Okay, do we have anything before it's a little after 2 o'clock? Do we have anything for the good of the order? Any member comments? Bridget.
So thank you, Todd, for providing that information on the Baker acting. For me, I've had a lot of conversations from families, and it's such a broad discussion that was just the first part where I wanted to look into it. And it's easy to hear Baker Act, and there's so many things that go into that. So, but I found it, I don't know what even the right word is, overwhelming. I was very surprised at that number. I knew we have 43,000 students, but I did find it, I thought in my mind, and whether I was right or wrong, but it did give me some sense of the severity, and that's what the Baker Act would in fact be, of what each school is dealing with. And what I wanted to do, especially as we move forward with the very likely potential of having additional categorical mental health funding, is to, I think we talk about it all the time, but I don't know that we really have outside, and we can all visit schools and see that, but to really have a good handle on the variety of things that are taking place and at each school. I mean, Oak Park I know is very unique, so it's an outlier on that, but in making sure, or kind of hinging on what we were talking about, that they're getting the resources that they in fact need. I was shocked, again, the Baker acting I was quite taken back, especially in elementary. And I think it also is a wake-up call even for the community, that they may not really realize that young I mean, even though we talk about it, that this is taking place. So being sensitive to obviously individual cases, I don't know. I didn't want to keep drilling down unless the board was interested in going down that, but I found it very interesting, and I'm just curious if we're tracking it and how we can do a better job kind of providing support in those roles.
I think Sonia's tracking it very closely because I think it's a requirement with the state. And some of these protocols that are being used now are requirements that I had a parent who called me about a Baker Act situation, was very upset. And when I, found out about what the actual story was, it was quite different from what the mother thought it was involved. And, I think that we have some children who really have some problems and some families that have some problems. It breaks my heart. But, I think those numbers are interesting. I'm personally, since I printed that out in the middle of the night, I'm going to talk to Sonia one-on-one about it. Shirley?
I've got a couple things, but on the Baker Act issue, from my background in collection agency business, when somebody is Baker Acted, say there's somebody on the street that's acting out and whatever, and so they Baker Act that person. That person is charged. You have to pay for being in that facility. I don't know if maybe there's something that's different with the students when they're Baker Acted, but I think students don't pay, or the family.
It's their responsibility.
It is their responsibility. I mean, they first pursue insurance, but then they pursue self-payment, and then in many cases it goes uncollected.
To me, if I was a parent and my kid might have been acting up, and if police were called and Baker Acted my child before I showed up to perhaps de-escalate things, because it's a very expensive procedure, and I don't know what other districts are doing, but I think it's something that we look at, because it's not only the impact on that student or everybody else or the staff. I mean, is that the best thing we should be doing? I don't know.
It's threatening bodily harm to self is one of the big reasons. Or others. But one of the bigger ones that I'm hearing is to self.
Suicidal, yeah.
And that scares me, when you think.
I know. It's a lot. And then, yes, look at the liability if there's a student that's threatening to commit suicide or hang themselves or whatever, and we don't Baker Act that person, what the cost involved. But
what the ramifications
But I would maybe have them look at that. Is there any other on that? Or
I just had a really quick question.
Caroline first.
On the Baker Act, before we go, I just wanted to ask, were those that the district had I don't know, instigate is not the right word. We Baker Act or initiated, thank you. Or is it that just we have aware knowledge of it? Because a family can certainly Baker Act their student and then let us know so that we can provide services.
This was done during school. I think these are all
correct.
During school hours.
It wasn't just us. Matter of fact, school district personnel, short of sworn law enforcement, does not have the ability to Baker Act. So that would include all of the agencies in our school, to include the Department of Children and Families.
Okay.
Caroline?
One thing I'd like to ask you is, do we notify a parent should a student be suspended?
Yes, ma'am, we do.
Do we try and engage parents in what we do for their students and engage them in discussion?
Yes, ma'am.
Because it's been said that we don't involve parents. I think the only place where we're not asking for parent and we're depending upon the student is with the LGBTQ students. That's when the student has to inform the parent. Other than that, we inform the parent.
As a matter of fact, if you go deep, particularly with our ESC students, before we can convene an IEP meeting, there is notification after notification. As a matter of fact, they spend a great portion of an IEP meeting going over what the parent rights are within that process. Matter of fact, it consumes probably 15 minutes of the beginning of that meeting in regards to what are your rights, and if you don't like what happens, what are your rights to appeals. So yes, I would say we go to great lengths to include parents in this.
I know that we spend a lot of time putting together meetings and trying to bring the parents in to participate in programs in the schools, and invariably they don't show up. And it was very frustrating because we did a lot of that in the past. And so I know we're reaching out for parents.
Eric?
Yeah, I got this in my packet, the thing from, oh, she's gone, Tracy. And on the sentiment page, in the center, in the middle, it says SRO voted in favor of police union. Will we be getting a contract for them, and what's the timeline? And
So they've gone through the organization process. They've selected IUPA as their bargaining entity.
people in the town?
IUPA doesn't have a strong presence in the state of Florida. Typically, you see PBA and a couple others, but IUPA represents city of Sarasota.
Is that, the building on Main Street, on Ringling?
I don't know if they has a physical presence, but
There's a building that has IUPA on it.
yep,
It's either that or independent brewery.
yep, it'll be fine with me too.
Okay. So what's the timeline when?
We have not met with them yet. We've received their initial demand to bargain, and so we are putting together our team, putting together their team. Leonard, who represents us in collective bargaining, matter of fact, has great experience working with police and sheriffs throughout the state. Our thought process is to have an initial meeting with them to see what their initial contract proposal is, and then to have an executive session with the board to share that with you. Normally we would do executive session before going into our first bargaining, but because we don't have an existing contract, what we've asked is for them to bring a contract forward, and then we'll executive session and then respond to it.
So is this just the line staff? Is it line and sergeant? Where's the delineation of where
Well,
they
that will
voted?
be the subject of some debate. We have taken the position that because it's a small agency, that our sergeants are supervisory. In larger departments, like if you were to go into a sheriff's office, those sergeants are included in the bargaining unit. And so that will be one of the topics of conversation is where do you draw the line into what the bargaining unit is?
Okay, thank you.
Shirley?
One of my issues that I was talking about also was contract negotiations and executive session. Are we moving forward on that? I mean, I would like to see that we have the contract done, before this one expires on June 30th, and I would really like to see it done before the teachers go home. Middle of May. I mean, but we're like, are we going to be having any executive session? I mean, there's two issues. There's the executive session regarding dollars, but then there's the executive session regarding contract changes. And, and I know that there's several things in our contract right now that conflict with the law. And as you said, too, we've got to follow the law. They give these statutes and they get, so where are we on getting, inviting people to contract? I mean, to negotiate, where are we?
So our contract expires on June 30th. I think expires is a different term in collective bargaining than you have in traditional settings. That contract stays in effect until a replacement agreement is negotiated. We did, on the first of the month, send a demand to begin bargaining. That was the 90-day point out. That's our official request to begin bargaining. We had some informal conversation leading up to that. I don't want to speak on behalf of the union, but their informal response had been that they preferred for us to get through testing and open bargaining mid to late May. But I've not seen an official response to our demand to begin bargaining that was sent last week.
The testing, why would that be in conflict with what? I mean, I don't know. Who is on that bargaining team? I mean, how many teachers that would be testing would be on that bargaining team?
I can only speak to past bargaining teams. We've put out who our bargaining team would be, but I've not seen a proposal from the union as to who their collective bargaining team would be. It does include a number of teachers. Whether they're in, quote, tested subjects is really based on their makeup and who they decide to invite in.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Bridget?
No, you can go ahead. That's what you wanted to.
I just want to know, I know we talked about this. Sorry. And I appreciate you delaying it because you delayed it for my likelihood of being out in March. But are we going to bring back the cell phone policy discussion? It was actually
but
on
not
this.
today.
Well, no, I recognize that. So
Yeah.
is that in a coming meeting
Yes.
brought to you by? Okay.
Yes.
Where school starts?
Eric?
No, not
I've had comment.
I think I said Eric, but
I thought he said no.
oh, he said no. Okay. Then I will say Shirley.
I've had contact from a parent regarding a parent regarding Oak Park, saying that she feels that we've somehow changed our policy that we want to graduate students after at 18, and that we are not providing services through 22. I mean, is that? I've only heard it, and it was at lunch, and I don't know.
That's not district policy. That's federal law. So that's
22.
Federal law says we get rid of them at 18, or
no, ma'am. It says we service them until the year at which they turn 22. So we service them through.
and so we are servicing them at 22, not graduating them at 18.
Okay, so we have a commencement ceremony. Typically, we do that when they're 18 at the age of their peers, but then they return for additional services. There is one commencement. Sometimes we have parents who come forward and say, well, why aren't they graduating this year? And we say, because there's only one commencement and they commenced in the year they turned 18. And so that may be the question, which is...
So they have the commencement, which is the graduation, but they can still stay for services?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
We did 55 graduations last year, which was the largest number
So just
I
because
ever
they
know we
graduate
have
doesn't
done.
mean they're out the door.
That is correct.
All right. And the other issue, and there's going to be a meeting tonight, I believe, Democratic Environmental Caucus, I get the emails from them, regarding two issues. And one is the cement factory across from Booker High School. And I've been getting emails, you know, and have been forwarding on, and I thought we were doing a study on it or something. I mean, somebody said they were looking into it, and I got an email this morning saying, where is this? Is somebody going to be at our meeting tonight? Is there something? And the other issue is the lead in drinking water. Where are we on the lead in drinking waters? If you have any answers on those two things.
All right, so two separate, distinct issues.
I know.
And so
I'm thinking of skipping and going to early bird or something instead.
All right, so let's start with the concrete plant. Is that we are not in possession of a report, but we have commissioned a report as to what the environmental effects specifically are, the dust that come from it's a concrete recycling, so they're composting and it creates a dust coming onto the campus of Booker High School. I think there's a number in the community that the issue is not related just specifically to Booker High School, but that entire community, although our study is specific to Booker High School.
When did we commission that?
I don't have the exact date.
All right.
I have seen the communications you've had with Jody. Jody is adamant that he never promised that report to be available for tonight's meeting, although there are some who say that we made that commitment. I was not party to the promise, so I don't know.
What does this mean?
So there's a meeting tonight at Robert L. Taylor talking
Yeah,
about the
Robert L.
effects of
Taylor.
the concrete plant on the North Sarasota community.
And
It's not our meeting, but certainly we would be party to it, having a
6 o'clock or 6:30?
All right, so
Well, you
that
want to
answers
go? I'll stay home. All right. Yeah, I'll say, oh, I can't go. Eric's going.
So did that answer the question about concrete dust? Okay. All right, so I am anti-lead. That's probably a good place to start. We do have a testing program in regards to identifying any lead that may be in the drinking water. When we detect that lead, there is a protocol. And so we do not have wide-scale issues like other districts well to our north. Hillsboro is one that's in need. Yeah, it's not that far north. I'm cautious when I say north because most people think Manatee, but Hillsboro. But there is a protocol that we follow in regards to when that is detected. But we test obviously our oldest buildings, but are doing that on a rotating basis. And there's actually a way to remediate lead in the water.
We don't have widespread problems, and any problems that we have, we have tested, and anything that we've noticed, our kids aren't drinking lead.
A lot of times it's in the faucets. A lot of times it's in the actual faucets.
And some of it's the plumbers.
That's what many school districts have
and
told
that
me.
soldering that they use. If only we could blame the CPAs for this.
Plumbers, operational error on their plumber.
So I'm trying to identify the question in that. Have we detected lead in our facilities? Yes, we have. Is the problem widespread? No. Certainly someone could argue one fixture is too many, so I'm not going to certainly make judgments on the density of the problem and whether it's a problem or not. But when we detect lead, we respond immediately to it. And we actively test for lead. We don't just passively wait till it comes to our attention.
Thank you.
And I think a lot of the questions are stemming from the legislation requiring us to test post 1968, I think is the construction date, which how many schools do we have that are,
Well, we have a number of buildings.
Handful,
The pipes may be from 1968, although presentable fixtures. So,
but that's where the questions were stemming from and how that's.
Is there a plumber in the house?
Yes. Dude, never take a cookie from Eric. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay, is that it? We are adjourned until our till our board meeting at 3 o'clock.
So he's cleaning a toilet, and brown stuff is coming up. Was it then off? So he's got brown water all over his hands, and we walk out, and I wash my hands.